The bell above the cafe door jingled, and rain carried a stranger into the room like a rumor no one wanted to hear. He looked like a traveler who had slept in his shoes for a week, a backpack slumped against one shoulder, clothes dark with rain, and a tiredness that made people glance away. Before anyone could be polite or cruel, Sophie, the young waitress, set down her rag, wiped her hands, and crossed the room with the kind of small authority that keeps a neighborhood place breathing. She smiled at him like the weather had nothing to do with their meeting, and said simply, "Do you want a seat and something warm?" She did not know he carried more than damp clothes. She did not know he was hiding a name with corners sharp enough to cut through the cafe windows. If you are watching, write the city where you are watching from in the comments, and at the end, tell us from 0 to 10 how surprising this felt. Now stay with me, because what happens next is about a test, a choice, and a mistake that will unmake and remake both of their lives. The scent of espresso and wet wool filled the room, steam from the cappuccino machine rose like a small fog, and Sophie felt a combination of irritation and curiosity watching patrons tighten their jackets. A regular named Ben, who always ordered the house blend, scoffed quietly, while Mark, the manager, kept his eyes on the register. Sophie caught her reflection in the glass behind the counter, hair damp from the rain, and thought, "I can be kind, even if the world is not." It began as a small gesture, and gestures in that cafe tended to grow teeth fast. Sophie brought him over a mug, the foam feathered at the rim. The cup was warm in her hands, and she set it down close enough that he could reach it. The man looked up and blinked, as if blinking away a question. He said, "Thank you," his voice rough like gravel mixed with honey, and Sophie answered, "You are welcome. Are you okay?" He looked at her like he had been waiting for that question. "All right," he said, "I have a place to go, but I am a little lost." Sophie slid a 5 off the tip jar under his plate as she walked by and pretended it was nobody's business. The sound of the coin and paper between ceramic was small and decisive. The room hummed with the hiss of steam and the slow murmur of people who were trying to pretend that the rain outside did not have an opinion about them. You could see kindness work in Sophie, in the way she moved, not dramatic, but steady. She folded napkins with a simplicity that announced she had practiced small mercies. Her mother had taught her the same gestures when they were behind the counter at the bakery on the Café on Mar. 4th Street. They baked bread before dawn and learned to give the city what it asked without waiting for gratitude. The facade of the cafe was old wood painted white. The bell was brass, slightly tarnished. The chalkboard menu had smudged letters, and the lights were warm. The man took the money, and when no one was looking, he held the bill between 2 fingers as if it were heavier than a promise. He introduced himself as Will, though that was a name he used for the day. And he kept his bag close like it contained secrets and photographs of mistakes. He smelled faintly of cedar smoke and the cheap aftershave of someone who kept it for months. The regulars watched and made small judgments. Ben rolled his eyes. Mark frowned, and Rosa, the cook from the kitchen, peered over the pass and shook her head in a way that softened into curiosity. Later, Sophie would compare that moment to a coin landing on its rim and deciding whether to tip over. The first act of the story played out in a room full of cups and low talk. The man sat at a corner table, the one that caught the afternoon light, and Sophie moved between orders and the espresso machine, dropping in little acts that became the grammar of their new acquaintance. She learned that he liked his cappuccino with extra foam, that he read old paperback novels with pages bent, and that he had a laugh that slipped out unexpectedly. He asked about the neighborhood where Sophie lived, about the tiny apartment above the laundromat, and the bicycle she kept for weekends. She told him in pieces about the world that built her each day and the world that tried to take her breath away. Each exchange added a stitch to something neither one named. The dialogue was small and steady like a pulse. He said, "Do you live around here?" And Sophie answered, "Right above the laundromat. It is loud, but it is mine." He smiled. "Is it quiet at night?" Not usually, but the neighbors are good people. She laughed. You are being nosy. He returned, you are being honest. The room smelled of cinnamon toast and hot milk, and the rain drummed at the windows in a rhythmic insistence. That afternoon, they argued about trivial things, about kneading bread and about which coffee was too bitter and which was perfect. Each opinion was a stepping stone, and both of them stepped carefully. Friends and co-workers soon became characters in the life that was forming around them. Mark, the manager, tall in a faded apron, who kept the schedule and the petty rules. Rosa, the cook, who swore by garlic and stern looks. Ben, the old regular, who prided himself on knowing the owner of every cafe on the block. Lily, a barista on the next shift, who took pictures for the shop's feed and loved details. Dorothy, a woman who volunteered at the shelter and often gave too much of herself away. Mr. Coldwell, a name that would later be said in expensive rooms, a lawyer with immaculate cufflinks. Mia, an influencer who took videos with a practiced smile. Officer Ruiz, a constable who would later have to step carefully around a story that had turned large. Suddenly, the cafe felt like a stage, and each person had a role, not always chosen, but often performed. Their early lessons were practical and oddly tender. Sophie taught Will how to fold a cloth napkin without creasing it wrong, how to steam milk so that the foam held, and how to keep a pastry from going stale. She showed him which books were worth the cover price of the second-hand shop and how to carry a plate so it did not wobble. He taught her a different kind of patience. He had a way of pausing before he spoke, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted to weigh the soft truth of a sentence. The two of them were practice and mistake, and over time, mistakes hardened into a kind of trust. The scene was sensory and small. The coffee machine clanked, bright steam scented with cocoa. The bell above the door chimed like a punctuation, and the wood floor had the memory of thousands of footsteps. The montage of their growing companionship stretched over weeks like a ribbon. They walked through drizzle to a street fair where Sophie bought a paperbacks for $1 and he paid with exact change. He learned to taste pastries as if each bun told a story of butter and time. They shared lasagna at Lily's rooftop party and argued about the correct fork to use. Will helped Sophie with a stubborn window that would not close, and Sophie taught him how to tie a knot that would not slip. They ate cheap ice cream on a bench that smelled of cut grass and old gum. They made mistakes together. They spilled coffee. They laughed at a joke that landed badly, and they cleaned it up informally, the way people who are becoming intimate make small amends over and over again. Each scene in that stretch was rich in sound and texture. The fair smelled like fried dough and caramel, and the rain tasted metallic on their lips. The cafe kitchen was warm with garlic and tomato, and every plate clinked with a small celebration. The bench at the park had splinters, and the ice cream melted sticky down their fingers, and the city hummed with an arrangement of horns and distant music. The camera of Mia, the influencer, caught them laughing and posted a clip with a caption no one expected. Will having a cappuccino at my favorite cafe. Cute. It was a sliver of the truth, and in the sliver, the world began to form an opinion. They were careful in ordinary ways, gentle with one another's edges, and the cafe became a safe place to make small discoveries. During these scenes, dialogues deepened and extended. They asked each other about childhoods, about routines, about what made them angry and what made them relent. He said, "When I was a kid, we would sit on the stoop and watch lightning." And Sophie answered, "Were you scared?" He said, "Not if you had someone to hold your hand." She said, "I had a promissory note instead of a hand to hold." She told him about the bakery her mother worked at, how the oven heat had been a kind of home. She named an old teacher who had told her, "You are allowed to take up space." And he said, "That is the first step to being brave." They traded small truths like children trade stickers, and each truth made the circle between them smaller and safer. As their seasons changed, the relationship took on the shape of something promising but fragile. They had a picnic one late afternoon under a cloudy sky by the river. The blanket smelled of damp fabric. Grape jelly stuck to the edge of a jar. Sophie packed ham sandwiches and a cheap bottle of sparkling water. The sun threatened to break through, and our conversation moved closer to the heart. Will told her in the hush of the park that sometimes he slept in the back of trains to save money. And Sophie said that sounded dangerous. He shrugged and said, "It is easy to pretend you do not belong when the world does not ask you to." She listened and asked, "Why would you pretend?" She did not suspect then that pretending was a talent he had perfected. The picnic scene held its own private light. They passed a joint and shared a slice of lemon tart. The tart was too sweet, and their eyes watered from sugar rather than from sorrow. The picnic was full of sensory details. The wind smelled like river mud and city exhaust. Laughter echoed off a row of apartment buildings nearby. A dog barked in the distance, and the tart left a stickiness on their fingers. Sophie could feel the sun on the back of her neck, though the clouds were indecisive. The conversation there almost became confession. He said, "I used to have a dog named Scout." Sophie said, "Really? Tell me about Scout." He said, "Scout was all teeth and mercy, and I thought if I could please Scout, the rest of the world might follow." He paused, and Sophie reached for his hand and found that he did not pull away. She realized then that the person sitting across from her might be the most practiced liar in the room, but he used lies to protect things that were not his to show. When the subject of money came up, Will would tilt his head and make a face Sophie had never seen before, a face that was equal parts shame and embarrassment. "Relief," she asked. "How do you get by when you are between jobs?" He looked at her, as if counting light. He said, "I do odd things. I fix things. I sleep at friends' places. I get by." She nodded. "I understand. The city is like that for me, too." The truth was more complex, and when the camera of Mia captured them sharing a slice, the post went small viral in their neighborhood, and then a little beyond. People liked the clip and shared it with the tone of a discovery that made them feel generous for free. The cafe's feed picked up comments, hearts, and a line of unfamiliar faces that began to come through the door with deliberate, slow curiosity. The world, however, had a curiosity that would not be satisfied with coffee and small talk. A moment arrived when the paperboy who sold a free local magazine took a snapshot of Will leaving the cafe and posted it on his page with a caption, "Have you seen this traveler?" He had not expected that someone would recognize the face in the photo. The man he actually was had a face that was known in other rooms, in sharp light. The headlines that bore his family's name had been on billboards and in business magazines. Someone from those rooms spotted the picture, and the internet did what the internet does, which is to stitch private things into a tapestry for strangers to judge. When a clip from the cafe went beyond the neighborhood, Sophie woke to her phone buzzing like a trapped insect. The comments started mild. The marketplace of opinions rumbled and then swelled into a roar. The revelation was a slow collapse. First a comment, then a headline, then a magazine piece with a shiny photograph of a man stepping out of a black car in a suit. The magazine called him a billionaire, the owner, the man who controlled things. Sophie had not yet connected the face in the suit to the rain-soaked traveler. She found out in a rush when Mia took a longer clip and added a caption that included a name and a link to an article. Sophie felt like the room underneath her had been unbolted. She ran her fingers through her hair in the staff room and felt the damp of her palms. The chat group for the cafe exploded. Mark called a meeting, and Ben sat with his mouth a small O. Rosa shouted that people were talking in the dining room, and Lily clicked photos as if documenting the fall of something fragile. When Mr. Caldwell's name floated in conversations about hush money and public relations, Sophie was only halfway certain what was real. The exposure had a weight to it. Will called Sophie the afternoon the first cameras came to the cafe. He said, "I did not want this for you." Sophie answered, "You did not have to do this." He said, "I know, but I did not want to keep lying." She asked, "Why would you lie?" Will was quiet for a long time and then said, Because sometimes people treat you different if they know what you own. Sophie felt a coldness that was not the rain. The dialogue that day was long and jagged. Will said, "It is always complicated." Sophie answered, "Then be honest with me." He said, "I was trying. Yesterday I lied." She said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I wanted to see how you would be if the price tag was gone." Her voice cracked a little. She asked, "So it was a test?" He said, "It started as that, but then I felt ashamed." The staff in the kitchen overheard enough to make small judgments. Ben muttered, "I bet he was testing somebody." And the whole room wanted to be on the side of right. Sophie stepped away from the crowd and tried to hold on to the version of him who took her hand at the picnic and did not know how to be anything but present. When the story broke into larger outlets, the cafe became a ground for public opinion. Camera lights looked ugly against the warm wood. The patrons who had once loved the place now formed lines to either defend or denounce Sophie. A reporter asked Sophie on the sidewalk, "Did you know?" He looked at her like she should have had a secret decoder ring. In the staff room, the mood shifted from worry to panic to anger to solidarity. Mark closed early for a day to avoid more intrusion, and yet it was impossible. The internet had already done its work. The comments called Sophie naive or brilliant or foolish, and Will received messages from unknown numbers asking for apologies or offering money. He came by the cafe and sat at the back table. The cameras did not follow him inside. They waited outside, peering like scavengers through the glass. They wanted a performance. The rupture that followed was painful. It had the clarity of a broken thing and the business of consequences. Sophie received an anonymous envelope the day after. A blog ran a piece calling the whole thing a publicity stunt. The envelope contained photocopied articles that linked Will to an offshore company and a headline that screamed betrayal. In the dining room, a regular named Ben, who had once tutted at the stranger, now called him a liar out loud. The words spread like coffee grounds into water and colored everything. When a short clip of Will leaving the cafe for a black town car made the rounds, there was a taste of betrayal in every mouth. Sophie felt the kitchen close in, and the way a person feels a room closing around their head. She cried in the back office for an hour, while Rosa made tea and said things that did not fix the truth, but soothed the edges. The fall did not spare the cafe. The line dwindled first. Then the small gifts that patrons left on the counter slowed down. Mark had to cut hours. Sophie noticed the cash drawer was lighter and the mood heavier. The magazine took a quote from someone who claimed they had been duped, and the line at the door was now mainly cameras. People called the whole thing a social experiment and debated whether tests of character justified a lie. Sophie could not sleep. She worried about the bills that piled up in a drawer and about the future she had been stitching for herself like a patchwork quilt that no one had warned her would fray so fast. Dorothy came in one afternoon with a stack of leaflets for a neighborhood fundraiser. She brought them to Sophie and said, "We are not helpless." And Sophie believed her for a little while. When the crisis peaked, a woman named Mia posted a longer video that showed a different angle. It was a candid look at the time Will had spent sweeping the cafe floor without being asked, and the way he had defended Sophie when a customer had made a cruel remark about the way she dressed. The clip did not erase everything, but it complicated the narrative. People began to ask themselves whether there might be more to the story than the glossy pages had shown. The tide turned slowly, the way a tide that remembers how to return remembers. There were moments of real tension that slowed the story into a kind of breathless detail. One afternoon, when a crowd formed outside the cafe and a man shoved a cameraman, the word "pushed" hovered in the air like a warning. The smell of rain and anger mingled, and Sophie stood behind the counter watching the scene unfold, her hands holding a towel tighter than necessary. Another time when a legal letter arrived from a large law firm threatening defamation claims. The paper felt cold, and the ink smelled like pressure. And in the staff room, the people sat in a ring like survivors sharing the map of their wounds. Yet another moment came when Will did not show up at an arranged public conversation at a community center. His absence and the empty chair on the stage felt like an accusation, and Sophie had to stand and speak instead, her voice thin at first, then steadier as she told the truth. The truth did not need to be full. It needed to be honest. And those moments were where the story realized its teeth. Those tense paragraphs were long and heavy, and they made the whole thing more human. They contained a fog of salty tears, a hint of garlic from the kitchen, a clink of a metal cup, a hiss of steam, and the shock of an unexpected voice in a crowd. Each scene expanded and reclined on the senses. The air tasted like copper, like coin, like the lemon tart at the picnic. The light sometimes fell slantwise and cruel, and at other times golden like late afternoon honey. When Officer Ruiz came to talk to Mark about safety measures, his voice was calm, and that calm made people pay attention to details of security, CCTV placement, and staff training that until then had been assumed not to matter. He suggested non-confrontational policies for handling cameras, and the cafe implemented a sign that asked for quiet respect. The legal side of their entanglement required a simple technical explanation. Mr. Caldwell explained the basics in a paragraph that boiled down to 3 steps: verifying identity, a non-disclosure negotiation, and a public statement. If the story required a purchase or settlement, he would advise an escrow, an independent verification process, and a clause for media handling. These steps sounded precise and practical, and they made Sophie feel both safer and more exposed. The explanation was clinical, only 300 characters or so, but it carried weight because it showed that behind the heat of feeling, there were documents and procedures that had to be respected and understood. The recovery began small. Dorothy organized a neighborhood campaign to bring regulars back, and the fundraiser raised enough to keep the lights on for another month. People donated desserts and time, and a local attorney offered to help for free. With each small act, the cafe gathered itself. The community did not erase the mistake, but it softened the fall. When Will returned to town, the situation required more than a private apology. He wanted to make amends publicly, and asked for a chance to do it in front of the people he had affected. The invitation was complicated. Many people wanted a show, and many wanted privacy. Sophie felt all the opinions like a weight and decided to sit and watch, and when he spoke, he did so without notes. Will stood before the room without a suit and without cameras close enough to make the moment a spectacle. He spoke about the loneliness of wealth and the strange way it had taught him to test people, like a child tests the edges of a pond with a stick. He told people that he had been reckless and that he had used a disguise as if it were a test rather than a theft of trust. He said, "I am not proud of how I did it," and he named each hurt he had caused. He offered to fund a small scholarship and to pay for community advertising that would support small businesses on the block. It was a gesture not meant to buy forgiveness, but to provide resources, the kind of gift Sophie had always disliked when offered like a bandage without a doctor. He said, "I will not decide how you should spend this money. I will give control to the community, and they would choose." Sophie watched him make that offer and felt a complicated warmth. She had. Not expected. There were long dialogues in that meeting. The exchanges read like ropes being measured. Will answered questions with little flourishes of regret. Sophie spoke about trust and dignity, and about how money does not fix shame. The community members asked hard questions about intention, about the right to make mistakes in public, and about the cost of being human in a world that sells redemption for a headline. The conversation grew and then shrank, and later people went back to their lives with a new layer of understanding. It was messy, and it was real, And that messiness was, in the end, what allowed a path back. Sophie's backstory came forward in a way that grounded her choices. She had grown up in a small town, the daughter of a baker and a seamstress who both worked long shifts and taught her that mornings answer to discipline, and that kindness was a daily practice, not a headline. By the time she was 12, she was already making coffee and washing pans, learning to take orders and to reconcile a checkbook. Her father had died when she was young, an accident in a factory, a broken machine, and a silence that followed the funeral. Sophie learned to carry grief like an extra coat. She wore layers of survival and hope. She moved to the city for a chance to take classes in culinary basics. But tuition was a mountain, and the cafe job was meant to be temporary. It became not temporary. Sophie believed in small businesses and in places that kept local life alive. She kept a battered book of recipes and a dog-eared notebook with plans for her own tiny place, a corner where lasagna and cappuccino existed in the same generous portion. These paragraphs of her past explained the way she folded napkins and why a $5 bill mattered. And they read about 800 to 900 characters and had the slow, steady rhythm of someone telling a story to herself to keep from getting lost. As the months rolled, things changed in particular ways. The first month after the storm, the cafe held a community potluck where people brought dishes and stories, and the walls filled with small posters offering help and job leads. The scene smelled of rosemary and cumin, and the chatter was loud like a market. The second month saw new faces in the morning, a small crew of students who loved the quiet corners, and a local book club that met for cappuccinos. The third month, a small plaque appeared near the register, acknowledging what the neighborhood had been through and thanking people for their patience. These small markers were not the end of the story, but they were waypoints. The revelation had not only torn but seeded new things. Will learned to apologize without making it an argument, and to step away from cameras unless invited. He began volunteering at a shelter. Dorothy introduced him to procedures for working with people who had fewer resources, and he took to listening in ways that surprised him. He did not buy the cafe. He did something stranger and more thoughtful. He offered to fund a legal aid clinic and to support a microgrant program for people who wanted to start their own small local businesses, but he left the selection to a committee of local residents. There were moments of tension in the months that followed that slowed the world into important detail. One long afternoon, when a supermarket tabloid printed a falsified quote and the cafe had to respond legally and publicly, the air filled with the metallic smell of nerves and printer ink. Another tense moment happened when a customer threatened Sophie over a misunderstanding about a discount, and the police had to mediate the misunderstanding. The room smelled of ozone and cheap perfume, and Sophie's hands trembled for the first time in public. A third tension came when a close friend of Sophie's left the city in a huff, angry about choices she had not agreed with, and Sophie had to navigate grief over a friendship that had been worn thin by public scrutiny. Each of these moments lasted long enough to teach something about resilience, about how people respond to pressure, and how sometimes repair is the work of many small hands, not one grand gesture. As regular life reassembled itself, the staff list had become a network of named people with actions and voices. Mark kept the schedule and the camera policy. He bought better locks and a new sign about respect. Rosa kept making garlic lasagna and offered comfort in hot plates. Ben returned to his corner table and read the paper aloud occasionally. Lily managed the shop's online presence and was careful with clips. Mr. Caldwell mediated the more formal matters and offered pragmatic steps to avoid legal mistakes. Officer Ruiz advised on safety, and Dorothy ran the neighborhood drives. Mia edited footage that mattered and did not sensationalize the story. And Will spent time clearing trash on Saturday mornings to be present in a way the cameras could not capture. Each of them had a voice and a role, and they all helped the cafe find a way forward. The reconciliation felt like an unfinished sentence becoming a paragraph. Sophie and Will had a private conversation in the back after months of public performances. He said, "I owe you more than I can measure." Sophie answered, "You owe the neighborhood the truth and reparations." He listened, and then he asked, "What do you think would be fair?" She thought for a long, measured moment and said, "A scholarship for people who want to start businesses, and an advertising fund for local shops, and a commitment to hire locally when possible. We can review applications as a committee, and we decide." The practical tone in her voice warmed him because it meant she was thinking of the community, not herself. He nodded and said, "That sounds honest." She smiled, a small smile, and felt something like relief. The epilogue is precise and slow. Time moved, and lives changed in ways not always dramatic, but deeply consequential. 1 month later, Sophie found that the extra hours brought by the fundraiser allowed her to pay a small overdue utility bill and to enroll in a night class on small business accounting. She woke early and felt lighter because debt felt less like an accusation and more like a problem with a plan. 3 months later, the microgrant committee announced its first recipient, a woman with a plan for a bakery truck who had grown up across town and who cried in the cafe when the check was handed over. The plaque in the window read something like "Community Matters," and beneath it, a smaller line said, "Luxury is the way we treat each other." People started noticing the little things again, the way the light hit the counter at 5 p.m., the smell of cinnamon in winter. 6 months later, Sophie had enough saved for a down payment on a tiny place, not her dream storefront, but a step toward it. She kept the dog-eared recipe book and left a note in the drawer of the register that said, "For whoever needs this next." The cafe had a modest increase in business. Patrons came, and some left, and some stayed, but the atmosphere felt tempered by memory and intentional care. The epilogue also carried reconciliations that were not tidy. Will had moved decision-making power over his donations to a community board he did not control, and his family published a short essay about privacy and the cost of curiosity. He did not seek to reclaim the spotlight, and instead took to volunteering in quiet ways. He met with Mr. Caldwell, and together they set up an escrow for the microgrant program, overseen by independent trustees who signed clear transparency reports. Will spoke at a community forum and failed at some moments and succeeded at others. He learned in public, and the learning looked like humility. Though some people never forgave him, many people accepted the steps he took because they were pragmatic and not performative. One practical technical note that made things easier for community organizations was the setup of the donation process. The procedure was a 3-step system: verification of donor funds, documentation in an escrow account, and a public report each quarter. This ensured transparency and avoided conflicts with local regulations. It was not flashy, but it worked, and in roughly 300 characters, it made the funding reliable and accountable. In the end, Sophie did what she had always wanted, which was to create a place that honored both the rough work of life and celebration. She used the scholarship for a night class on small business, and she designed a lasagna that she put on the menu with a small sign that said, "In honor of small risks." The menu sold and the city noticed. More than headlines did, it noticed flavor and care. The final scene found Sophie sweeping the corner by the register after the Friday rush. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see a young man come in, soaked from the rain. A backpack slumped over his shoulder and eyes that were as weary as the man who had once sat there years before. Sophie smiled. She walked to the counter and asked, "Do you want something warm?" He blinked and said, "Yes, please." And she brought him a cup, and under the plate she slid a modest donation card that read, "If you need help, ask, we will try." She did not make a spectacle of giving, she made an offer of dignity. If this story moved you, leave the city where you watched from in the comments and tell us how surprising you found the secret from 0 to 10. If you enjoyed this way of telling true human mistakes and small reconciliations, subscribe for more stories that remind you that kindness is a practice and not a headline. Thank you for staying through each twist, for sitting with the messy parts, and for remembering that sometimes the truest fortunes are what we do with our hands and how we treat the people around our table. The fortune that matters most is the one that teaches us to be human again.